Daniel, welcome to the show, dude. I'm really excited to talk to you today.
Luke, I appreciate you giving me a call back and following up from the last time we talked.
Yeah, me too. So
it was one of the best podcasts I ever did.
Second time's a charm, we can only hope. And what he's referring to, those of you listening to the podcast, is we recorded about a month ago, and we went for like an hour and a half, man, and we covered everything you could ever want to know about EMFs as they pertain to your personal devices, etc. And we were both like, yes, like doing the virtual high five afterward. And then when I went to download the files, which I do a backup, that's what's funny. I do the video on Skype, and then I have an app called Zencastr, which captures the audio. And all four files, because there's two files, you know, there's two people, so there's two files. All four files were corrupt and unlistenable. So I sent them to my producers at Crate Media, and I was like, "Can you guys salvage this?" And they're like, "Honestly, it's not even listenable to us." And so the audience would never approve of this. So that was a trial run. We're going to do it again, and maybe we can. We might even be more focused today, having given it a second shot.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me again, Luke. I appreciate it.
I'm stoked, man. I'm stoked because EMFs in general are a topic that I'm really excited to share information about. And more so specifically, what we're going to be covering, of course, is, we're going to dip into some different areas of EMF, but essentially, how they relate to our devices, because I think that's the thing that we have a really hard time getting away from. If you find that you're living next to a cell tower, or you've got a wall of smart meters on your house, you have the ability to move away from that to some degree.
Right.
I don't think any of us are willing to not have a laptop or a cell phone or a tablet or something. So I've been kind of like struggling with, well, how do I keep my devices and use this technology without, harming myself? So I'm stoked. So you've been in the game for a long, long time now. You've written a book, which is a really great, simple read for those listening, called Radiation Nation, The Fallout of Modern Technology. And if you could give me like the truncated version of how you got into the industry of EMF protection in the first place. What's your background?
Sure. For 20 years or so, I ran the technical laboratories for the Bell system and electronics. All the infrastructure used to communicate phone calls for all these years, I ran technical laboratories for this stuff. So I had a lot of background from Bell Labs and subsequent companies that do that work. And 7 years ago or so, my sons were visiting. They're dull men, and they were typing away on their laptops for hours at a time. And my wife says to me, that can't be good for them. That's electronic stuff that's close, and I want grandchildren. This can't be good. And I said, you don't know what you're talking about. This is low-level energy. There's no way this is ever going to hurt you. But I said, okay, let me look into it a little bit. So I looked onto the medical side, the research side of this stuff, which is quite a lot and been going on since the 60s, 70s. And I found that even back then, we knew that after about 3 or 4 hours, 25% of the male sperm is immobile. So it definitely affects the body. And as you pointed out, you're not going to throw your technology away. Neither are my boys. So I said, well, look, what can I do? And I said, well, I can shield it. I can stop the signals that are closest to the body. And by doing that, I remove most of the harm potentially from those transmissions. So I built a prototype because I'm a mechanical engineer as well. And so I built a prototype for them. Their friends liked it, so I built a couple of more for their friends, and then it became a nightmare. I kept on going with this.
Yeah.
And building more and more products that are designed to fix the stuff you don't want to throw away from protecting you when you use it.
Right. So can you describe the different types of EMF that we're dealing with when it comes to devices? Because, I think a lot of people just think it's the RF that's, the signal that's coming from our phone or our laptop using Wi-Fi, but there's a few other things that these devices can also be emitting.
So Luke, when you were talking about at the introduction, you mentioned something about smart meters. And you were saying, we can find ways of fixing that. Well, there's two aspects of a smart meter you worry about. The RF, the radio frequency signal, and then there's also the extremely low frequency signal. The byproduct of electronics running through the wires is 60 hertz emissions that are coming out of your walls. It's coming out of your microwave oven, your toaster, your hair dryer. There's emissions coming out of that. When you're really close to that stuff, that is as dangerous as radio frequency stuff. But it's different because it's a different spectrum. Radio frequency, as you may remember, is typically around 2 gigahertz. The ELF is around 60 hertz. So it's much, much lower, but it still can interfere with the body. And so those fundamentally do different things. It's also true that with RF, many people don't realize it's a microwave signal. In other words, your microwave operates at 2.3 gigahertz. Your cell phone is about 2 gigahertz. They're almost the same thing. But guess what? It's still a microwave signal. It's a thermal emitting signal that can damage the body. So those are the two different types we worry about.
I remember a few years ago when I first started going down the rabbit hole with EMFs and stuff, there were these videos. They're probably still on there, and guys, write in my show notes if you can find these videos. They're fascinating. But there was one in particular where they took an egg, and they put an egg on a little pedestal, and then they put two cell phones calling each other on either side of the egg, and it cooked the freaking egg.
Yeah, right. Actually.
Have you seen that?
Yeah, that's because it's a thermal emitting signal. That's why. In fact, with the cell phone, they restrict the amplitude of the signal so it doesn't fry the center of your brain. But guess what? As an adult like you, it maybe goes in 1 inch, and it heats up the cells around your head as much as 2 degrees. If you're a child, it goes completely through your head, doing the same thing. It's heating up the cells, but more importantly, there's a lot of biological impacts to that as well.
And I'm assuming it's worse for kids because their skull is so much thinner, right?
Yeah, they're soft tissue. The softer it is, the more susceptible it is. So it's kids, very, very young kids. They're like 3, 4, 5 times as it's 3 or 4, 5 times more dangerous for them to use it than it is for an adult male.
Yeah, I always kind of cringe, when I see a well-meaning parent with their kid with a tablet or an iPhone or something that's sitting on their lap, or they have it up in their face. It's like so tempting to politely say, hey, you might not be aware of this, but there's some facts. It's funny. I've told this story so many times on my podcast, so regular listeners, forgive me for flogging a dead horse here, but I've been so EMF aware because of seeing videos like the egg getting fried. From that point on, I use a speakerphone. I mean, I don't think I've ever put my phone to my head, except maybe getting an Uber at the airport or like in an emergency situation where I couldn't use speakerphone. Now I can because I've got your DefenderShield, so if it gets loud, I do. But still, I tend to use the speakerphone. But when I started becoming aware of this, unknowingly, I was living in an apartment here in LA that was about 100 yards across from 2 giant cell towers.
Wow.
The multi-tower ones, but they were hidden by this sort of facade of a wall. And I was living there for 3 years, and I started having all of these horrific symptoms. My eyes went bad. I started having to wear glasses, just incredible brain fog to the point where, sometimes I just couldn't even work. I'd have interviews like this, and people didn't know, but I was struggling to even put a sentence together, and woke up with severe headaches every day, just, on and on. Got colds and flus, which I haven't, I've been healthy for so long. There was years where I didn't get a cold or a flu. Anyway, I had all these symptoms, and then eventually I figured out by investigating the building across the street, accidentally or not, perhaps it was the unseen hand that was guiding me over there to see it. But I instantly started looking for a place to live, and I moved into this house, which is in the hills and has no cell service, which is has its own challenges that I found out. But anyway, what I did is when I moved out, I emailed the other 3 tenants in that fourplex, and I said, I'm not trying to be a tinfoil hat guy here, and I don't want to instill fear in you, but I would be remiss to not let you know why I just suddenly moved out, and take the information and do with it what you will. But I sent them a photograph of our building, including those 2 cell towers with a couple arrows pointing to where they were. And then links to a few studies and videos and stuff. And I said, hey, just so you're aware, some people are more sensitive than others. I think I'm one of those. And not one of them emailed me back, And so I was like, well, at least I did my job. And then the lady that moved in after me, she started getting my mail. And I thought, well, I could send her that email. I said, you know what? It's none of my business. I don't want to freak people out. None of the other tenants answered my emails. So maybe this is just my thing.
Yeah.
A couple days ago, anyway, she found another package for me, and I moved out almost a year ago, and I thought, God, what a sweet lady. She could just throw them in the garbage, but she emails me and says, hey, there's a package here on the porch. So I sent her that email and I just said, hey, not trying to be weird here, but I thought you should know. And she emailed back, and she was like, yeah, I'm very aware of EMFs, but you know what? I like living in the city, and I don't care.
Right.
And so it's like, those type of situations help me to realize it's not my job to go around and be the EMF police. Even when I see a kid with a cell phone on their head, it's like that's their karma, their journey. And I guess my work is interviewing people like you and building awareness without instilling fear. And so that brings me to kind of my next question, just on the psychological front. If we're knowing that women that keep cell phones in their bras get breast cancer in short order, and men, their sperm gets immobilized from having a laptop on their junk and all of this, where's the fine line between awareness and walking around with anxiety and fear about these things being in our environment?
So when we talk about these devices, there's a lot of different ways you can minimize dangers. Very simple things. And we're going to get more detail about those kinds of things. The simple things you can do that eliminates much of the concerns. But there were some very important things you were mentioning. You had foggy thinking. You maybe had headaches. Those are electromagnetic radiation hypersensitivity responses to exposures. You're a canary in the coal mine to some extent. There's over 20% of the population that we know is hypersensitive. Yours is a little bit more than the average, but it can get extremely worse in time. So hypersensitivity is a really sort of big deal when you talk about this stuff, even more so than the linkage of cancer related to these kinds of things. Like, for example, frontal lobe cancer has increased 2% over the last 10 years, compounding over 10 years. Frontal lobe. Well, that's what you would expect to see because that's the softest part of the brain tissue that is most impacted by a cell phone. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But in general, you're really more worried about your stuff than you are worried about cancer, in a sense, because it's debilitating, and it can be extremely debilitating. And so when you have a cancer description of a cell phone on a breast, for example, there's virtually no question about it. There's a direct correlation to the cancer in the breast from the transmitting cell phone. If you're a woman in the first trimester, out of San Francisco a couple of years ago, they gave RF meters to a bunch of women in their first trimester. And what they found was the high levels of exposure, those who were in the high level of exposure were 3 times more likely to have miscarriage. And so there is no doubt under high long-term exposure periods, there can be pretty serious consequences. But and we know that there are clear scientific evidence, replicated evidence through multiple studies, well-written studies, well-structured studies that show pretty serious damaging long-term exposure kind of conditions.
In terms of the regulatory agencies that implement safety standards, give us a bit of background on when the laws were created and how they're so terribly outdated. I don't know the data on that, but I've heard you talk about that before. It's like, we're going off cell phone studies from 1973 or so. It's like
right.
It seems to be that it's kind of a fox in the henhouse situation where you have like at the FDA you have ex-heads of Monsanto.
Oh yeah.
And, there's all this pay for play kind of funky stuff going on. So what's going on with the FCC or other regulatory agencies that should be protecting the populace but are not because they're perhaps in bed with some of the tech companies, et cetera?
Right. So I'll start off by talking a little bit about the standard. Over 30 years ago, cell phones came out, and the standard was based on 6-foot males that occasionally use a cell phone. And the standard was established that the strength of the signal can't be more than 1.6 watts per kilogram, because they knew a 6-foot male would have that signal penetrate the skull by 1 inch and heat up the area by 2 degrees. I often tell the story that 30 years ago I'd had a cell phone, but I had no one to talk to because no one else had a cell phone. So occasional use back then was very, very so often and very, very short because you couldn't afford the minutes on your cell phone. Fast forward today, that standard, which by the way, that standard was only concerned with the thermal impact, the heating up. Everything you were talking about before was a biological response, which is far more, as we now understand it, far more dangerous than any thermal impact could ever be from these kinds of transmissions.
So is there no regulation then for the radiation that's going into your head or your private parts from using these devices? It's just about like putting a hot thing against your head?
Right, literally.
Oh, that's so insane.
And I'll break it into more detail, which I hate to do, but a standard 6-foot male, if he had concussion and had a blood-brain barrier breakdown, that's no longer true. The cell phone will go to the center of the brain, the frontal lobe. So if there are certain body conditions that you have, it can be worse. So that was when the standard was. It only talked about thermal, and it's been never updated over these many, many years. Recently, the FCC approved 5G, which is the 5th generation technology, which, by the way, is fundamentally different than the standard when it became 30 years ago established in the marketplace. It was not a sine wave signal. It was now 5G, a digital signal that didn't work at 2 gigahertz. 2 gigahertz, by the way, is 2 billion cycles per second. And the 5G can work up to 300 billion cycles per second. So all of a sudden, the standard has virtually nothing to do with the current technology that we are integrating into our devices. And sort of the fox in the hen house that you were referring to is 20, 30 years ago, I actually worked in the industry for a long time, as you know. And there was a guy named Tom Wheeler who was the head of the CTIA, a consortium specifically lobbying the federal government for the service providers, the cell phone service providers. And he had that job for 10, 15 years. And about 7 years ago, he was appointed as the chairman of the FCC. And as the chairman of the FCC, he had 5G standards introduced to his organization to be approved or disapproved. And so here we have the guy that represented the cell phone industry making a decision about a technology. And his decision was, we don't have to test this. We don't have to make sure it's safe. We have to make sure we deploy it really quickly. And so here we go. We have up to 300 gigahertz of signal that's being transmitted at the front of your house. And it's not been tested. The standards for presenting safety for the user hasn't been reviewed for 30 some odd years. And that's what's being deployed with 5G today.
And what's the difference between the 5G millimeter wave and the 2G, 3G, 4G that we've been using and sort of progressing through? Like, what's the difference of the biological effects? Because there's so much noise within the health community about the dangers of 5G, even above and beyond regular exposure. So being near, in a smart grid kind of city, as they call it. I love that they call it smart too, because it's so dumb. But being, close to a 5G transmitter, why is that worse than being near a regular cell tower?
So there are a lot of reasons for that. But let me talk about why is this so much different than previously. When we spoke about ELF, extremely low frequency at 60 hertz, that's really, really, really low on the spectrum scale, on the left-hand side of the spectrum scale. And when we talk about microwaves, we talk about it a little above the left-hand side of the scale. So it's not much farther. 2 gigahertz from 60 hertz sounds like a lot, but it's really not too much. We're talking about almost approaching X-ray speeds, which are in the terahertz space. And so it's very, very fundamentally different, because now you're at so much faster speeds. And by the way, when the standard was created long ago, they weren't a pulsing signal. When the standard was created, it was on a constant load signal. Now it's pulsing signals. Pulsing actually is more damaging to the cell than a constant load to a cell. So there's a little bit of mechanical breakdown of the cell that happens more with this. But with 5G, as you increase the speeds, this isn't a nanometer. It's just a continuation of speeds. It's going much more fast, not quite as fast as X-ray, but it's getting there. As time goes on, it'll actually get up to that point. But so you're increasing it, and then you're asking me, what's the impact? No one knows. There's been literally no study work. And as a research scientist, you don't speculate. However, I can give you some idea what potentially can occur. We don't know. But bugs like to propagate in faster speeds. The gut, for example, the good gut, the bad gut, it propagates better in higher speeds than up to 4G. So when you go to 5G, it's almost a different game. It's a different ballpark. But there was another really important point you were making before. You were within 1,000 feet of a cell tower. That was a 60-watt cell tower transmission, 60 watts. And so there was a lot of power that was coming down. It wasn't 1 watt. It was, by the time it was hitting you, maybe at 30 watts, half the wattage limit. So you had a fairly strong signal. With 5G, you can only go 750 feet, not the 4 or 5 miles of 4G. Why? Because the speeds are faster and the load drops down really, really fast. So it's really short distance. But guess what? It's at 20 watts being transmitted at what is referred to the small tower, the small cell. It's a third of what a standard cell tower. And what I wanted to mention before, it's the amplitude of the signal where you are 3 times more likely within 1,000 feet of a cell tower to get cancer than the average population. And so would I speculate Do I know what the problem's going to be with the small cell tower distance? I can't. But I know from research that the closer you are to a higher power level signal, the more likely you are susceptible to biological changes to your body. I'll give you a story about that. I work with a neurologist. He called me up on a Saturday morning and he said, my head hurts. I'm saying, well, how do I know what's going on with your head? And I said, what are you doing? And he said, well, I just moved into a place and I have, I'm in a cabin somewhere and I just got new cable service. And I said, did you get a coaxial cable or did you have a wireless service? And he said, how did you know? I have a wireless service. I said, oh, chances are you have 5G. His heart was hurting so bad because of that 5G signal that he was a canary in the coal mine. He immediately felt it when he was so close to the towers. So I think there's enough projection of concern from historical evidence of body response up to 4G, where we really should be concerned even more so with 5G.
Something I find terribly disconcerting about the 5G wavelength is, well, is millimeter waves not the technology they use in those relatively new TSA airport scanners?
No, it's even worse than that.
Because I don't use those. I have TSA pre-check and I go through the old school, metal detector. And if there's not one of those, I'll get the pat down. I'm like, you guys can take me in the room and do whatever you want with me. Like, I'm not walking through the millimeter wave. That's like a little 5G coffin,
it is. But worse than that, you and I are in the university. We're gonna go complain about something, and all of a sudden the Army truck comes up and it directs a signal to us, and it's a active device intended to break up crowds, and it's at 90 gigahertz. Remember, microwave signals go up to 300 gigahertz. Wi-Fi goes up to 300 gigahertz. So we know at 90 gigahertz, they use it in crowd control. It's not power water. It's used for crowd control. And what's actually happening there, by the way, when you have sweat glands, they're little coils underneath the skin. And when they put the 90 gigahertz signal towards you, it acts as an antenna. And it draws the antenna in. That's why you get so hot. That's why you run. So we know in some of the spectrum, it can be pretty seriously dangerous to you. In fact, you will run from it. And that's active denial that's used today in armies and crowd control.
There are videos, and hopefully these can make it in the show notes as well. It's interesting, though, because information like this is now being quickly censored from YouTube. So I implore someone, start creating other platforms where information like this can be shared. But I have seen videos of them demonstrating the military applications of the millimeter wave, aka 5G range. And essentially what you're describing is they have a tank, and rather than a water gun or bullets or, those bean bags or any of that, it's an invisible wave. And then you see people just start screaming and crying and running away. I mean, they show it being tested, and it's like, oh, you're going to move into a neighborhood that is actively firing those same signals toward your house or your office. I mean, it's just nuts,
Yeah.
One other thing that I find confusing about the 5G thing, and I meant to kind of stick to devices, but this is such a hot conversation right now, and one that I think is so important. But myself and people that write into the show and follow me on social media have a really difficult time discerning which of these new towers are 5G, because the old cell towers are, like these panels that are maybe 3 feet tall and, 10 inches wide, right? And there'll be a bunch of little sticks up on a pole, that's kind of the classic, maybe the 4G cell towers. And then in LA, we have now, especially in the canyons, like in Malibu and Topanga Canyon, here in Laurel Canyon, where there's mountains that prevent cell towers 4 or 5 miles away from getting into the canyon. They have these little short dogs hanging off the phone poles in both directions, facing, in other words, both directions of the road. and there'll be every single or every other phone pole will have these, and they're maybe 16, 20 inches high and 8 inches wide, these small cells. And I always thought that those were 5G. And then I had my friend Brian Hoyer, who has RF meters that are specially designed. Actually, they're used by the telecommunications companies, and they go up to, I think, 30 gigahertz. So they can test kind of at the bottom range of what 5G would be. We went out and tested those, and we're getting no signals. We were getting, within the normal range of 4G. And so I don't think those are, because a lot of people will send pictures to me on Instagram and be like, is this 5G? I go, I don't think it is actually. But now we have these little cylinders. They look like a giant soup can, and they're white, and there's nothing else on them except that. And I suspect that those might be the 5G ones. So is there any way to identify visually what a 5G cell tower looks like versus one of the older ones?
The height, literally the height of the stuff you see. When you see it at the very top of a telephone pole, that's possibly it's a small cell site. It's a traditional 4G cell site. But when it's lower, it's highly likely to be 5G because they can only go 750 feet. And that means they don't worry about going over the hill. They worry about only getting to your house. So the lower it is, the more direct it is. And so when you see the lower units, that's more likely to. And by the way, they can convert as well. They can show as 4G transmissions, but they can convert them to 5G.
Interesting.
But you'll see now, if there's a new installation, it's more likely than not 5G because of the cable service telephone providers are not spending money on any traditional technologies. It's all the new stuff.
Well, here's what's weird in LA when I see these new strange-looking cell towers that'll be on the top of like a lamppost, for example, right in the middle of Hollywood.
Right.
What's strange is you'll just see one, and there aren't any others around in many cases. Like you just see one on one street, so that would indicate to me that that's probably not 5G because if that one little tower only goes 750 feet, they would need to have them going up and down the whole street for them to do anything, right? I mean,
yeah, right. So Luke, we've been talking up to 300 gigahertz, right?
Yeah.
In 5G, there's actually 4 or 5 different signal levels around the 3 to 5 gigahertz range, even down to 900 megahertz. It's depending on the application. 5G talks about a whole network, a whole new network, and there's a bunch of parts to it. And one part may act as an intermediary with other parts of it, and they interconnect. And that's this web of stuff, transmission stuff, is all controlled by control stuff above it all. So when you see these new stuff going in, they may be actually in the lower range. And that lower range is not as concerning as the really high range, which is only in the small cell. It's the stuff only in front of a house that would likely be 5G.
Okay,
that you worry about.
Got it. And another strange thing about this rollout, because the 5G rollout is so shrouded in mystery, there's not a lot of public knowledge being shared by the telecommunications companies because they're about profit, not about informing the public of safety precautions. Yeah. But another thing that's interesting is some people's phones in different towns and cities will pop up, and when you look at your phone and the service you're getting, like right now, I think, let me see what mine says. Mine, I don't get service at my house. That's right. I'm on Wi-Fi on my phone, but your phone will usually say 3G, 4G, something like that. Yeah. I notice if I go to a less developed country like Costa Rica, my phone always drops down to 3G, and there's an indicator on the top of your iPhone that tells you what network. And many people now have phones that are popping up as 5G, but they're not in a 5G area, and they're not near any visible 5G towers. Do you think that's like a test that the different phone companies are rolling out to make your phone receptive to 5G, even though you're not in one of the networks yet? So, believe it or not, you didn't intentionally ask me this question, but it's a very good question.
5G will coexist with all the previous technologies for the foreseeable future. So when we talk about, as you just did, about it registers 3G or registers 4G, it will continue doing that because those transmissions will continue. And when you're picking up a 5G, it's possible it's one of the intermediary transmissions, and not the small cell transmission, which you probably wouldn't see. So, and by the way, you probably didn't pick it up, but when I said 20 watts, no one knows that. That's sort of a pretty important point. When you talk to those who are talking about these problems, it's not a general, well-known, understood. It's 20 watts being transmitted at the front of your house. It's 1/3 the power level of one that goes 5 miles for 4G.
Wow.
That's a big deal, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Because I think that's what's going to bother you more than cancer to the brain, for example. You're going to feel that more so than you do 4G.
The next thing I'd like to clear up for people is the terminology that's used when we're looking at our in-home Wi-Fi network. You have a Wi-Fi router that's transmitting radiation throughout your house, and that radiation carries your data, as mine is right now in my office, so that I can use my cell phone and a laptop and the Sonos system and the Dyson heater and all the shit that runs on Wi-Fi, unfortunately. Right. But people seem very confused that if they're picking up a 5G signal from their router, they think that's the same thing as 5G cell service. So could you explain the difference between a Wi-Fi router number and the cell phone network that's out in the world on the towers and all that?
Absolutely. 5G that we all hear about these days is 5th generation. When we were talking about ELF, we talked about it as hertz. When we talked about up to 4G, about 2 gigahertz, that's the actual speed that's being transmitted from your cell phone to the cell tower. When you go and you talk about a router, it's at 2.4 gigahertz or 5.6 gigahertz. That's the actual speed of the transmission. Has nothing to do with 5th generation transmission. It only has to do with the speed of the transmission.
Got it. So
does that help?
Yeah. So it's semantics. In other words, people just need to understand that when you're talking about the 5G rollout worldwide and smart grids and smart cities and this horrific stuff that's being developed and released without any safety testing that many communities and citizens are fighting against, that's a completely different thing than when you have your Wi-Fi in your house and you can set it to 2.4 or 5 gigahertz because it'll say 5G when you're picking up the signal in your house. So I just wanted people to understand that. Now, in your opinion, for those of us that have the option of running a Wi-Fi router in our house on 2.4 or 5, which do you think would be the safest? Because I can set mine to either one and it works the same. The speed seems the same. Receptivity within the home seems the same. But I've heard differing opinions on which one is more biologically harmful in those two different wavelengths or signals in the home from your router.
From a scientific medical point of view, there is no difference. And I can say that so definitively because there has never been research that clearly tests one against the other. So when you think of these things, you define it as no difference. So there is literally no biological difference that science knows about. Now you can speculate that it's possible that 2.4 is better than 5.6 because it's a less speed. But when you're at those low-level speeds, there's appreciably very little, if any, difference at all to the cell itself. So I wouldn't do it. So it's more a question of, do you want your data faster or not? One's twice as fast as the other. That's it.
Okay, because I think if I'm not mistaken, I think mine's still on 2.4, and it seems to work fine. And
yeah, it does.
I think ultimately the solution when you're dealing with your home, I mean, in a perfect world, this would be my strategy. I'll run this by you and just share this with the listeners. I lease the home that I'm in now, and I'm in the process of looking to buy my own house. Since I'm leasing, it doesn't make sense to spend $20,000 using shielding paint. However, I mean, it might cost $50,000 to tear out all the wiring in the walls to shield all that, to do shielding paint, EMF curtains, in other words, to turn the whole home into a Faraday cage, and then hardwire all the devices so you have Ethernet ports in every room to plug in your phone, to plug in devices and things, which I think that's like the ultimate, the best harmonious, safe kind of home strategy. In this house I'm in, as I said, I don't have cell service, so I've got to have the Wi-Fi on. So my intermediate strategy is to just have it on a timer, and the Wi-Fi turns off around the time I'd go to bed every night and then turns back on in the morning. And then I also have a few devices around the house that have been very effective for my symptoms. One is called a Soma Vedic. I have a couple of those around the house, and then I have these Blue Shield devices, and it's definitely helped kind of harmonize the field. It doesn't block the EMF, but it absolutely improves sleep and gets rid of the headaches and some of the other symptoms I've experienced. So shielding your whole home, hardwiring everything would be the most hardcore way to do it if you really wanted to be protected. And if you owned a place and you wanted to invest, you could do that. But for those of us that are renting or living in an apartment and don't have the finances or the opportunity to kind of like biohack our whole property in that way, let's go ahead and move into some of the strategies of the various devices. And I want to talk about our cell phone, tablets, and laptops to see what we can do, because I know you make some great products that protect these, but I'd like to talk about specifically kind of the emissions that are coming off our devices generally. So we could start perhaps with a laptop. From what I understand, and like your DefenderShield pads go under the laptop, so mine is just Velcroed permanently to the bottom of my MacBook, and just that way, I don't have to go grab it. It's on the airplane anywhere I am. So the radiation on the bottom, for what I understand, is 99% blocked or something. What can we do about radiation or magnetic fields or electric fields coming off the actual keyboard, the trackpad, the screen, all of that on a laptop?
Let's talk about those things. But I think what you just spoke about earlier is so important. This is not, you don't panic. You don't talk about how endangered you are from the technology around. You can take actions to do things. And I think you are pointing to some very, very solid ways of minimizing exposure. And that's what you do. The fact is, in your case, where you can, running an Ethernet cable to your devices, whatever devices you're using, is a simple thing. I have a laptop. It's always plugged into an Ethernet. I never use Wi-Fi for that. So I'm not transmitting Wi-Fi. I'm using cable. So I'm reducing the number of transmissions in the room. That's a very simple thing to do. The other thing you did is you put it on a timer. You took probably 50% of the real dangers and you put them away. You eliminated them from being a concern for your body by simply turning it off. The other thing you can very simply do is move it away from you. As you push it away from you, the more and more you push it away, the better off you are. So if you have a router next to your head and you're sitting on a desk, that's not a good thing. But you take that same router and you put it 10 feet away, and much of the danger is gone. So by simply placing it away from you, you actually reduce the potential dangers to your body. You don't panic about it. You simply manage what you have in those ways, and you reduce it. And in fact, with devices in general, 100% of the problem with devices is when it touches your body. any part of the body. When you move it 1 to 2 foot away, almost 80% of the danger to the cell is gone, just by moving it 1 to 2 foot away. By 4 foot, most of it is gone. So by simply taking devices that you're not using and moving them away, you really reduce the exposures. And by the way, as we just spoke, if you're using devices and you're putting them aside, by turning them off, you're reducing the cumulative, the ambient in the environment. So, like in your case, you have a cell phone. You actually have a Wi-Fi transmitter on, you have a cell tower transmitter on, and you may even have a Bluetooth transmitter on. If you're not at home using the cell or the Bluetooth, turn them off. We often
so your phone's going to transmit 3 different. It's not just receiving, but it's transmitting those 3 signals.
Right. So just turn them off.
So in my case, for example, because there's no cell service here, which is why I moved here, I can go ahead, like I can show you, I can turn off on my iPhone, see if we can put that in the camera.
Yeah,
I can turn off my cellular service, turn off the Bluetooth, and just have the Wi-Fi on my phone, and that way it's only emitting one of those 3 signals, and I can still get phone calls and texts using my network.
Right, exactly. Luke, when we last talked, I talked about bees in the room. 1 bee won't kill you, 1,000 will. So if that's analogous to the transmitters in a room. If you have 1 transmitter in the room, you're not going to die. If you have 1,000, I'd be very worried. So turn them off. By simply turning off within your environment, you're reducing much of the dangers potentially to your body.
And with a laptop, I've heard that the electric frequencies coming off the laptop are exponentially higher and more harmful when it's plugged in. Would you agree that you want to pre-charge your devices, then use them rather than using them while they're plugged in?
So we spoke about ELF and RF, right? So you're not only getting the RF transmissions, but you're getting the ELF transmissions. 60 hertz stuff, the AC, the alternating current within your home, is also at play. It's not that it's increasing the RF, it's making multiple sources of emissions, both ELF and RF. And you're right. Simply by taking it, unplugging it, using it with battery, half of those transmissions that can be dangerous to your body are gone by simply unplugging it.
Right. And if you're protecting the bottom of your laptop with a device like you guys make, is there anything you can do about the emissions coming off the keyboard and the trackpad like on a laptop, or are those something of concern anyway? Like, would it be optimal to use a wired trackpad or mouse and a wired keyboard and keep your laptop screen even further away from you rather than having your hands like over those emissions while you're using it for long periods of time?
There's absolutely no question about that. In fact, we also often work with extremely hypersensitive, electro-hypersensitive people. And for them, we have fairly rigid rules. You have to create a workstation. If you use your laptop the way it is, you're going to be in chronic irritation all the time you use it. You have to manage yourself when using the technology. So if you take a new LED monitor and you put it to away, the danger of the screen is gone. If you put a wired pad versus a wireless pad, you eliminate the Bluetooth. In addition to that, you're putting the source of much of the emission away from you by 1 or 2 feet. So you're really reducing the emissions by 80% by simply doing the simple things you suggested. Having a wired mouse and a wireless keyboard connected to a tablet or a laptop really is important to some of us, more than 20% of us. And it's simple to set up, and you really provide a more safe environment for use.
Awesome. That's perfect. That's one of the things I've been intending to. I don't use a laptop that much, mostly when I travel, but I've been intending to do that. And even I had Brian Hoyer, the guy I mentioned before, come in and test my whole house, which, by the way, guys, it's a 2-hour documentary that I produced, basically him screening the whole house to teach people what's going on in there. And that'll probably be out, I think, by the time this does. So I'll plug it in the intro and the outro when your episode comes out. But he came and tested the workstation that I'm in right now, which is a big iMac computer, and my microphones and headphones, all the recording equipment. And this was one of the lowest EMF areas of the whole house, which I thought was so interesting, because I always thought, oh, I'm probably getting fried by this giant computer and all these mics. It's actually pretty good. The only thing that I could optimize, I think, on this workstation is I'm using the Apple, I'll put it on the camera here for the YouTube video. I'm using the Apple trackpad. And when I use this or I use my laptop, and it might be a nocebo psychosomatic thing too, but I swear my right hand gets sore. It like hurts in my bones.
No, it's literally true. That's what you're feeling is true.
Oh, okay. Because I don't want to believe that, but unfortunately, I'm so addicted to the trackpad, I can't use a mouse anymore. It's just so cumbersome, and I just can't move quickly and operate my computer with efficiency. And so they've not yet invented, an Apple trackpad that's wired, which drives me nuts. Because otherwise, my little workstation would be really, really legit.
Yeah, all your workstation is wired. That's why it's the way it is.
Right. There was a little ELF coming off the back of the iMac, but I'm quite far from it, so it wasn't an issue.
So it's pretty safe.
If you wanted to be real hardcore, you could put, like shielded power cables on the back of the computer essentially, but it's far enough away I didn't trip on that. Another thing I'd like to ask you about is Bluetooth devices that people use on their head. I see people all the time now walking around with these earbuds, and I just, again, like when I see a 5-year-old with an iPad on their belly or something, I just cringe. What's your opinion on the radiation level of Bluetooth devices on your skull?
Actually, I was hinting to some of that earlier. So let's talk about that. A standard cell phone shouldn't transmit more than 1.6 watts per kilogram. It can't penetrate by the standard. It can't really go beyond 1 inch. If you are concussed and you're not a 6-foot male, you're a female, for example, that Bluetooth signal is 0.3 watts. That's 5 times less than a 1.6 watt signal, 0.3 watts. What we know from research is that with a concussion, with the blood-brain barrier down as a result of the concussion, 0.1 watts, 1/3 below the level of Bluetooth, can disturb the cells of the frontal lobe. So they're crazy to run the risk of using it long term like that. It's not that it's moment. If you use it for 3 minutes, not a big deal. But if you put it in your ears and doing it for hours at a time, it's a constant transmission over a long duration of time, and that's when it becomes dangerous. And even though it's a low level, I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't recommend it.
It seems perhaps worse even now because you've got the earbuds that go on either side of your brain, so you're creating like this this field that's surrounding your brain. Even the old school little Bluetooth things on your ear would be just on one side, and for some reason just having it kind of the communication, the hemispheric sort of surrounding of your brain with even that low level radiation for a 3-mile jog or going to the gym for 2 hours or sitting in the office and not wanting to hold your cell phone. I just think, wow, that can't be good.
Yeah, and think of this. Some actually transmit separately, but not many. Most transmit to one that transmits to the other.
Oh, damn.
That makes it worse. That's 0.3 watts going through your head.
Interesting. Okay, and when we're looking at a cell phone, like an iPhone, I guess most people I know have an iPhone, but they all probably work the same. What areas of the phone are, provided it's not plugged in, like again with the laptop, we would advise to not use your phone when it's plugged in. Try to charge your phone and then use it when it's not plugged into the 60 hertz, power grid in your house. But in terms of the RF, the radiation, whether it be the cellular service, the Wi-Fi, or the Bluetooth, or all of them, which parts of the phone directionally produce the worst or the most signal that you'd want to avoid?
The top.
Really?
Yeah, that's where the cell tower communication's occurring, on the top. Wi-Fi, Bluetooth are on the sides.
So the cell service is on the top edge, and then the other signals come out the side?
On the sides, yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Typically.
Interesting,
yeah.
Okay.
And by the way, we haven't talked about any of this stuff, but, when you talk about a cell phone to the head, in telecommunications, it's called crosstalk, where I can be talking to you on one telephone line, and I hear someone else other than you. That's where one transmission is interfering with another transmission. Well, when you have a transmission to your head, the communications within the head is cross-talking with the communications from your cell phone. So it's not just, and we haven't talked much about it other than it's thermal and not much biological, but you're actually interfering with pineal glands. There's all sorts of stuff that's interfering with the very low-level communications infrastructures of the body. It's screwing it up. And so it's not just, am I going to get cancer in the frontal lobe that we're worried about? It's really the interference problems of these signals. And the clinics these days are finding out more and more that there is clear evidence of direct links between cell phones. Like the breast to cancer, there's breast to neurological and physiological changes in the body.
Got it. And so with the device that I have that you guys make, the DefenderShield phone case, which, by the way, when I first got it, it has a little wallet in it, where you can put, like a billfold, you have your bills and then credit cards. And when I first got it, I was like, man, I don't want to carry around this big-ass thing. It's so clunky, and my credit cards are in there. And I also felt really old, it's like an old dude thing to carry it all in one. And I'm hanging on to 49 as long as I can. But what's interesting that I found is now I can't stand carrying a wallet. Like, I'll be bummed if one of my credit cards that like my business card or whatever is in my wallet somewhere. I'm like, oh God, so now I have them all stuffed in this phone case, and I actually like just having to remember one thing. It's been really kind of actually a game changer just in terms of carrying stuff around. But I'm
glad you like it.
Yeah, it's cool. It's a great device. What I'm curious about, though, is, from what I understand, the shielding part of this case is the part that covers the screen, which is where the sound, your speaker is on that side too. Is that correct?
Speakers on the earpiece.
Okay.
And we go around it.
Right.
But remember I told you where the transmitters are? They're on the sides.
Yeah.
So we actually shield it from the sides. So our shielding goes up to the top. So we actually shield and the speaker. And when you talk, the microphone's on the bottom, and we don't cover that.
Right.
And so, by the way, I don't know if I told you this, but when I was developing this product, there was a 16-year-old girl that wanted a cell phone, and parents finally ended up breaking down and buying it for her. And she passed away from frontal lobe cancer a year later. That was the motivation of me building that, because I knew the signal could be stopped, and no one was stopping it. And a simple device like that stops the signal where it's most dangerous to the body.
So if you're walking around and you need to have your phone on and not on airplane or turned off, which is the case for most of us, obviously, we want to be reachable, then you would carry this phone here in your case with the shielded side, which is the face of your phone, the front of your phone where the screen is. You'd carry that facing your body. And then it's still going to be getting the cellular transmission coming out of the back of your phone, which is the part of the case that's not shielded, right?
Right. That's exactly how it works.
Okay.
It's that simple.
Because if you shielded all four sides with your case, your phone would be non-operational, right?
It wouldn't work.
Okay. That's how good the shielding works. Oh, well, that's good. Okay. So, and then I've heard that there's GPS and other things still activated even when your phone's on airplane. Is your phone still producing radiation when it's in airplane mode, or is it?
Yes.
It is. Okay.
Yes. And it's even worse with the newest stuff, the iPhone 11 and other new technologies, because they're using slightly different GPS stuff. So it's actually worse now than it was a year ago. So yeah, you have to be aware that when you turn it off and put airplane, it's not turning off all the transmitters. But they're spurious. It's not constant. It's periodic.
Got it. And then I'm assuming you don't find validity or efficacy in these other little crystal stickers and the quantum pads. And, over the years before there was a device like you make that just covers the whole damn thing up. I mean, I don't know how many different. In fact, I just found one on the bottom of my trackpad. I have some little shungite sticker thing, and I'm like, hey, it can't hurt. But I've never seen any empirical evidence as to the the effectiveness of these little stickers and quantum this and that you stick on the back of your phone or anything. Have you ever come across any of those devices that have any positive impact at all, or is it hogwash?
I try to be open about it, but we got to remember I ran technical laboratories for many, many years, and so for me, when somebody makes a claim about performance, you test it to see if it did what it says it's going to do. And so many products on the market have no independent, unbiased testing that substantiates the claim. And quite frankly, there are some arguments that are being described about the performance of some of these devices that defies physics. I don't know what they're talking about. And so, you really have to look for, as you just pointed out, some level of evidence that substantiates the claim. So many of them don't. And I would only make an assumption that if they don't have a substantiation, I would question the validity of the claim.
Right. Yeah, I think that's when you get into the EMF mitigation game, it's tricky because and I don't know that this is true for the little stickers that go on your phone and that kind of stuff. The only evidence I've ever seen that that's doing anything is if you do muscle testing, which is there's a lot of potential for placebo and things like that when you do muscle testing. In other words, if you put a sticker on my phone that's supposed to, protect me from the EMF, even though it's not going to affect an EMF meter's reading because it's not technically blocking, but let's say it creates a harmonious field on and around your phone, and you tell me that, and then I hold the phone against my solar plexus and you muscle test me and I'm weak without it, strong with it, that could be just because I have a strong belief that it's doing something, So
you can't tell. And by the way, that's called indirect.
Okay.
You can't trust indirect for the very reasons you said.
Okay.
It's not controlled.
Right. Okay. So with the devices, you have that. And then the thing that I find fascinating is, as I mentioned before, I have two different types of devices that are in my home. And because it doesn't, technically speaking, block the Wi-Fi in my home, for example, because my Wi-Fi still works when these devices are on.
Right.
However, I have had my N=1 own personal study in the case of the Blue Shield device, which is a scalar wave device, which essentially emits a frequency that is resonant with your body that renders your body to some degree impervious to the negative EMF fields because your body's kind of attuning to the positive field, therefore becoming somewhat invisible to the negative EMF field. And my evidence with that was when I was living next to those cell towers. I lived there and I didn't know the cell towers were there. I just knew that I felt like shit. And I thought, well, I'm going to put one of these devices in my house because I know I live in the middle of the city and there's EMF around. There's no need for me to test the levels because I already know There's just ambient radiation in my neighborhood anyway. So I put that thing in there. And then once I found the cell towers and moved out, I looked back and was like, holy crap. Before I even knew there were cell towers there, those symptoms like the headaches and insomnia and all those things stopped when I had put that Blue Shield thing in my house. Yeah. I got worse for about a week. I had some kind of, die off or, kind of a Herxheimer reaction. And that's what they told me it probably was, because I said, guys, I feel worse now that this thing's in my house. After a week or two, that subsided. Then my symptoms went down dramatically. And months later, I put two and two together, and I thought, oh, my God, that little scalar thing actually did something, even though you couldn't empirically test that it was, blocking that cell tower next to me. It was doing something. And in much the same way, these other devices that are based on not scalar, but on precious stones and semi-precious stones that emit a field within your home called the Soma Vedic, both of those companies do really interesting testing where they do live blood cell analysis, they do HRV analysis before and after, and even Blue Shield's done a couple interesting animal studies, which of course is impossible to placebo. The animal doesn't have a conscious awareness that you're doing any testing. They did these tests in New Zealand where they would go to chicken farms and cow farms that were very close to cell towers. And they would test the milk before and after installing these devices, and find that the milk with these devices installed on the property had a much greater nutrient density and fat profile. And then they'd take it away and it would go back to being kind of crappy milk. And with the chickens, the same thing. They would test the quality and size of the eggs. And they would also note the degree of infighting within the coop. And so these chickens that were under the stress of those cell towers would be fighting and picking each other and all this kind of stuff. And then when they installed the devices, there was just like peace in the chicken coop, and they documented all this. And so I find those technologies interesting, but I still I'm a bit woo-woo, but I also like a dose of science and empirical evidence here and there. But I find both of those interesting because they are able to do testing outside of the direct realm of saying, okay, this blocks EMF like your devices do on your cell phone, your tablet, your laptop, etc. So I'm encouraged that these companies are seeing a marketplace need and coming up with technologies that they can verify at least to some degree are having a positive effect, even though they don't interfere with your ability to use those devices by technically blocking it all. So there's kind of a middle ground, I think, between the little fake stickers that don't do anything and just having everything blocked. There's some in the energetic kind of quantum field. There seem to be things emerging that are useful, which is exciting.
And Luke, that's why I said right from the very beginning when we started chatting about this, I don't make an assumption that it doesn't work, because there are some things, like for example, some of the stones, they're fundamentally carbon. Carbon is it absorbs the emissions, believe it or not. So they're like a floating ground. And so there's very legitimate scientific evidence of what it can do, but they just don't realize what it is or they can't explain it. So there's a lot of stuff that I see going on that is good stuff, that does have a good market that has the need. And I think we should find out what they are and test them out.
Yeah, likewise. Well, I think between the two, a lot of the strategies we've talked about today, there's a lot you can do. And I also appreciate your perspective that it's important that we don't get bogged down in the fear and anxiety and run around with veins full of cortisol and adrenaline because we're terrified of our environment. Because I think, I tend to be on that spectrum sometimes. And so, I find myself being afraid of these fields and all that stuff because I have perhaps a mild PTSD of getting so ill from being next to them. I'm like, God, I never want to feel like that again. So it's sort of a balance, as I said earlier, of having awareness of these things and doing what you can and mitigating and kind of set it and forget it and live your life. Because it's probably worse for your health to walk around in anxiety with these stress hormones flooding your body than it is just, having a Wi-Fi router on,
It's funny you said PTSD, because Well, we know with the extremely hypersensitive, which is the worst side of the spectrum, there's always the fear. It's literally psychological that it builds up in your mind. And so it's really something that you need to overcome in a sense, because it's really true. The body's set up to protect itself. And so when there's an environment and you suspect it could be a problem, it is a problem because you're psychologically trying to deal with it.
Yeah.
So it's interesting you said that.
Yeah. I've been really into the work of Bruce Lipton and Joe Dispenza and these guys that are, into changing your biology using intention and, entering into the quantum field and working with things like that. And I've interviewed both of them about this issue particularly, and they both kind of gave me the affirmative kind of answer that I just arrived at. That is like, A, protect yourself whenever possible. B, don't be a victim of your limbic system and walk around paranoid, because that's even worse for you,
Exactly.
So
exactly.
I'm actually doing a program right now called DNRS that was developed by a woman named Annie Hopper, who suffered from severe chemical and EMF sensitivities and learned and developed a process of using neuroplasticity to heal the limbic system of its injuries, which happens throughout your life from various forms of trauma that put you in that perpetual fight or flight state, and this state of being, on a cortisol and adrenaline cycle. And so through that system, she gets people that are very sensitive to become unsensitive, and in some cases render them completely impervious to the effects of EMF and chemicals and things like that by healing the limbic system, which is fascinating. So that's kind of my next venture into, moving out of the anxiety and fear. But that said, I'm still going to have a DefenderShield on my phone, under my laptop. I'm going to turn my Wi-Fi off at night. I'm not going to live next to it.
Simple stuff to do.
So it's kind of a combination of both. I think the mentality of it and your attitude toward it, and loosening up a bit, and just taking the simple approach of just mitigating what you can.
Yeah. By the way, I like that story you're telling, because we're finding that I work with clinics, and we're finding that the cell phones, our ambient has picked up 1,000 times over the last 15 years. And so we see all these kids in school that having anger problems, more ADHD, all those kinds of things that are happening in our environment. And what they're finding is it's the brain that's actually appears to be being influenced in all this. And so it was characterized by one neurologist with me, is you're walking and your brain's sleeping. In other words, the brain patterns are screwed up. So when you're in bed, you're not healing. And when you're up, you're trying to heal. And so it's becoming more and more complicated with the presence of these electronics in our environment, and the way in which you deal with it has to be different. And so the first thing I thought about is when you were mentioning that, is that they have brain tap and other forms of systems that actually help the brain realign itself to where it needs to be. And we have things like WAVI, which is actually measuring the electrical resistance in parts of the brain, so you're gaining or losing in the clinic environment. So a lot of people are working on a lot of very important things in this true new space, which, by the way, I think more is the elephant in the room than ever before. It's pretty serious stuff.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned brain tap. I recently met those guys and got one of those devices. It's a kind of a neural reprogramming, brain healing meditation, earphone light show thing. It's very cool. I did one last night, and it has... Yeah,
that's Dr. Porter. I love the guy.
He's
brilliant.
Been
doing it for 30 years.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to interviewing him. But yeah, I love the brain tap. Last night I was listening to one about manifesting wealth and stuff, because a lot of his programs have guided visualizations and things, and it puts you in this theta state where you're very programmable and puts you in a position to use neuroplasticity to reprogram you. And so he'll do these guided visualizations and meditations while you're under that state and kind of imprint you in almost a hypnotherapeutic fashion to take on new beliefs and to let go of old ones. It's absolutely fascinating. Yeah.
By the way, that's how they've improved the ADHD response of the body with hypersensitive. That's how they did it. Wow. I've seen it actually change.
Oh, that's so cool. Exciting stuff. And by the way, by the time this comes out, guys, I should have, in addition to the DefenderShield products, I should have the Brain Tap on my store, lukestorey.com/store. Speaking of store, I appreciate your time today, and we've done a good job, I think, of sharing information with people without trying to slang products to them. But I love the products that you guys make, so I'd like to just open the floor now for you to just, give us a rundown of your product line, what devices they fit on, where they can find them, and things like that.
Well, as I said, we started with a laptop shield, the Defender Pad. It was done because I wanted to protect my sons and have grandchildren, which, by the way, I don't have grandchildren yet, 7 years later.
Thanks for nothing, boys.
Right. But I know they have a good sperm count. And so, but then I told you the story about the 16-year-old girl. That pushed me into the cell phone space. I was really frustrated. It was anecdotal, but it really, for some reason, drove home the need to try to do something about it. So we went into the cell phone. Ever since that time, we've kept on expanding our product lines where we have earphones, earbuds. We have headset coming out for the autistic. We're trying to create environmental EMF-free products for all people, not just kids but adults as well. And so we have a full product line there going. I'm a little sensitive to we talked about, this would actually work for you. We have a blanket we sell. It's actually a grounded shield. It's a floating ground.
I got one of those. Yeah, I've been taking it on the airplane.
You will feel different from it because you're sensitive. And it really calms your body down. So I didn't make it for you, by the way. I made it for protecting women who are pregnant because I know the womb is so vulnerable. But I found out later on that it really helps the body in general feel more calm, and it provides protection. We have sleeves, we have pouches, we have all sorts of different things. We're trying to build for the everyday use. If you want to look really older, like you're about 65 years old, we have a clip that you put on the side of your belt.
That'll do it. That's where we're going. That's my next step. When you really throw in the towel. I think once I can get away with that, once I lock in a wife and settle down, then I'll pull that out. Now it might be premature.
Well, a year or two from now, I'll give you a buzz.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, that's great, man. Listen, I appreciate the work you're doing in the world, and I appreciate when people make products that actually work. So kudos to you and your team for that. In closing, I'd love for you to share 3 teachers or teachings that have influenced your life or work that our listeners might be able to go learn something from as well.
I have a teaching. Life is pretty precious. You don't realize it when you're living it. So I always talk about, look at what you'll be thinking about on your deathbed. When you're on your deathbed, what's going to be important? Is Luke's podcast going to be important? I represented the telephone industry with the FCC. Every so often. I thought that was really important. Believe it or not, it's not very important. There's not a lot of things that are important that are truly important to you. And so this is a ride we take. It's a journey that extends, but there's certain very important relationships you build in that journey and cherish them because that's what you're going to think about on your deathbed. To me, that was like pretty important. And it's not theory for me. So you really want to see it as helpful hint in how you should think about your lifestyle. That's probably probably the most important thing in my mind. And it boils down to very simple. Be aware of the life you're living and where you're going, and make sure it's where you want to go.
Love it, dude. Thank you. And give us the URL of your website, social media handles, and all that stuff.
DefenderShield.com. That's DefenderShield.com. And that's where we have not only products, but Luke, we spend a lot of time educating as well. We have a learning section about 5G, for example. No one else has this stuff. We try to help people understand it. In fact, you don't ever have to buy a product from me. I don't care. But you should read and understand what it is your environment is, because the more you understand, the more you control. And so we have a learning section. We have the products under DefenderShield.com. We offer our products through Amazon, if that's where you prefer. But if you ever need help, give us a buzz. We spend a lot of time having a staff of experts that can really answer all your questions about electromagnetic radiation. And I used to answer the phone all the time. I could never get off because there'd be finally someone who can help them understand their environment. It's not a time to panic. It's a time to understand. It's environmental, and we need to understand the environment of our lives. So if you need questions about any subject outside of our products, that's fine. Give us a buzz.
Cool, man.
At DefenderShield.com.
I appreciate that. Well, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for enlightening me and our audience, and I look forward to talking to you again.
Luke, thanks so much for inviting me again. I appreciate it. Have a good one. Thanks so much.
Okay, we did it. Sound man, that would be the edit. Daniel, when we hang up, make sure that you don't close Chrome, because I'm going to stop that now, and I got to wait for those files to process, and on your end it could take a little bit of time. Ooh, wow, it looks like I already got it.
Oh, wow.
That was fast. I did one yesterday, and my episode was 3 hours, and it uploaded all night, and I still didn't have it in the morning. But just to be on the safe side, if you could just keep
yeah, no problem.
Yeah, just keep that browser open until I've 100% confirmed that I have the files on my hard drive here, okay?
No problem at all.
And I think this one actually worked this time. We got everything. Yeah. It's going to be perfect video.
And by the way, I don't know if I said it last time. I really did enjoy working with you because you're very casual, but your goal is to help people understand. And you have enough understanding to ask the right questions and bring people the information they need. You did a very good job.
Thanks, dude.
As you did last time. You did a better job last time. We just didn't record.
No, it's good, man. It's all about sharing information and helping people.
Yeah.
It's like think of how many moms, and we're still live streaming, by the way, on my other devices, but think of how many moms, for example, are going to hear this and then maybe think twice before they put a laptop on their pregnant belly. Just that is having an impact on.
Yeah, we didn't talk about it much, but in vitro, you interfere with at the in vitro level with electromagnetic radiation. So if you have a tablet by your lap or a cell phone in your pocket, that's influencing the womb, the child that's growing in your womb. So it's serious stuff.
Yeah.
I think I even told you, I'm sorry, I'm rambling.
No, it's okay.
I wrote a book, right?
Yeah.
Radiation Nation. And one of the most well-known radiologists in the country read the book, and he said, I don't know if I believe this. He knows ionized radiation.
Right.
About a year later, he called me up, and he said, I just had a woman come into my practice. She had a child. She was young, upwardly mobile, using technology all the way around her. She had the child had multiple cancers.
Wow.
I couldn't figure out why until I remember what you said. It can influence the womb, and which is true. And sadly, she lost a child almost immediately.
Oh, that's
so
crazy.
It's real. It's real.
It is. Well,
and a little bit of maintenance, and you're perfectly fine. Doesn't take much.
Cool, man. All right. Well, thanks so much, Daniel. I look forward to talking to you again. You going to be at Paleo Effects next year?
Yeah.
Okay,
we'll be
cool.
there.
I'll see you in the team. I'll see you in the team there if we don't talk before then.
Okay, bud. Thanks so awful lot. You have a good one.
All right, you too. Have a good one.